Today, we are joined by Kenneth Roth, one of the most respected voices in global human rights. For almost 30 years, he led Human Rights Watch as its executive director, guiding the organization through major international crises and helping bring attention to abuses around the world. Over the course of his career, Kenneth has written and spoken extensively about war crimes, authoritarianism, and the responsibility of governments to uphold basic freedoms. He's also the author of Righting Wrongs, 3 decades on the front lines battling abusive governments, a powerful look at the challenges and lessons from decades on the front lines of human rights work. Kenneth, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for joining.
I'm so glad I was able to join you.
Um, Perhaps I'd like to start at the very beginning with the person behind the public figure. Your book, Righting Wrongs, is part memoir, part strategic guide. You grew up with a personal history. Your father fled the Nazi Germany. That seems to have influenced your moral urgency. How much of the book is about personal journey, and how much is about strategy and institutional learning?
Well, I mean, first, you're right that I think, a big reason why I was drawn to the human rights cause was the experience of my father, who fled Nazi Germany as a 12-year-old boy in July 1938 for New York. And so, I grew up with Hitler stories. I grew up with what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis, worried about being beaten up by the brown shirts in the playground at school, worried about being arrested for riding his bicycle on the sidewalk, worried foremost that my grandfather, his father, would be arrested. And so, I was very aware of the evil that governments could do. And that's a big part of what drove me to devote my life to trying to prevent, that and similar kinds of atrocities. So, that was a big part of the motivation. I think also, I wanted a life that would contribute to the public good. That's why I went to law school. I was in law school when Jimmy Carter was the US president, who introduced for the first time human rights as an element of US foreign policy. This was the new frontier. And I was, very interested in being part of it and was fortunate in a sense to be able to get in on the ground floor. Now, the book is it goes into this. I mean, it goes into my personal evolution, how I learned how to do human rights investigations, advocacy, but it really is mainly a strategy book. It runs through many of the toughest problems that we faced. How do you address, the Chinese government? How do you guess the Russians, the Saudis, the devastation in Syria, the Israelis, the Rwandans, as well as the US government? And it talks about, on the one hand, just what happened. It's a history, but it really is a strategic guide because it explains what we were trying to do, what worked, what didn't work. And it shows really that there is always something you can do. I mean, even in dire circumstances, there's always a way that you can increase the cost to a government of its repressive practices. And that's what I want people to take away from the book, an understanding that, these are a series of choices that are available to everybody. And there always are some levers you can pull, which is going to make it harder for a government to continue on its path of repression.
Yeah. Well, hearing you talk about the roots of your commitment, leads to a question about how it's sustained after decades immersed in these grim struggles. What sustains your belief that human rights can still advance in our time?
Well, they can. I mean, the book is filled with illustrations of that. And so, obviously we don't win every single time. There are some struggles that are quite persistent, where the government hangs on through repression. But what I show in the book is that, we have been able to make, really genuinely life and death differences in numerous cases. That, the strategies of really, harming government's reputation, depriving them of diplomatic and economic benefits, these are tools that often work. And just because they don't work every single time doesn't mean they're not worth doing. If you stop an occasional mass atrocity, that's a big deal. And so that's what kept me going is the recognition that, often enough we prevailed. We made a difference in people's lives. And so even though I was, dealing with hardship, I was dealing with it for a purpose of avoiding similar hardship. And that is, it was very motivating. It sustained me.
Wonderful. But, nowadays the landscape is really difficult. I mean, around the globe, we see more governments embracing authoritarian practices. From your experience, what tools of advocacy still work in these environments and which ones no longer do? Very briefly.
Yeah, well, sure. I mean, obviously, the rise of autocratic populists, they have found a way to make some human rights violations popular. And so, if you go to Hungary's Viktor Orban and say,
Mhm.
you're mistreating immigrants, he would say, of course I am. That's my political program. So that kind of frontal approach doesn't work, within Hungary. Although I should say that he is now facing very significant, probably his toughest political challenge ever from Peter Magyar, who, could easily win the next election. But even in a situation like that, we found that there were other sources of pressure. So I describe in the book how we went to the European Union, where Orban's mistreatment of immigrants or of gays was not popular. And we're able to get the European Union to condition the huge subsidies that it gives to Hungary on an end to what they call his violations of the rule of law. And that, put very significant pressure on him. We did something similar in Poland. In Poland, it contributed to the loss of the Law and Justice Party. Orban is hanging on, but is under huge pressure to ease some of these repressive practices. And even within Hungary, these practices are popular with his rural base, but not popular in the cities. In this sense, it's actually similar to Turkey, where the cities are much more pro-rights. They don't want autocratic rule. In Turkey, I think the overall numbers are actually turning against Erdogan. In Hungary, it looks like something very similar is happening for Orban.
Well, the central debate is about the choice of tone and approach. Uh, human rights advocates argue over whether confrontation or cooperation works better with powerful governments. Which do you believe is more effective in the long run, and does it depend entirely on context?
Look, the only time that cooperation works is if you have a well-intentioned government that may be struggling to figure out the right way to protect rights. I didn't spend a lot of my time with those governments. I was focusing on governments that were dedicated to violating human rights as a way to stay in power. And to cooperate with them, to pretend that they're well intentioned, that we can just talk about a better way for them to govern, is utterly naive. You need to pressure them. You need to change the cost benefit analysis of repression. I'm going to give you an example of this today. I mean, the current UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, a guy by the name of Volker Turk, in
Mhm.
his 3 years in office, has never once condemned China for its mass persecution of the Uyghurs. He says, I'm cooperating with them. I'm engaging with them. We're having conversations. That is utterly meaningless. That's an abdication of his role because it means he's not investigating, he's not reporting, he's not condemning, he's not using any of the tools he has to pressure Beijing. He's just talking to them. They'll talk until they're blue in the face. They could care less, because when they're just talking, they're avoiding any pressure. And so I don't buy into this naive approach that talking with deliberately repressive governments makes any difference. You've got to pressure them.
Very interesting. Thank you. And of course, the governments often put security and economic interests ahead of human rights. How can advocates push for rights in such a world without being dismissed as unrealistic?
Well, I think it's useful you know, to look behind these claims. Of course, it's easy to say, oh, I'm violating human rights because we're going to grow economically. But if you look around the world, I mean, the autocrats who claim to be promoting economic development are often just serving themselves. Every once in a while, you get somebody like Lee Kuan Yew, the former Singaporean prime minister, who ran an autocratic state, but also built it economically. That is by far and away the exception. Much more often, you get somebody like, Venezuela's Maduro, or, former dictator in Zimbabwe, Mugabe, or in Zaire, Mobutu. These are people who repressed rights, were completely corrupt, totally destroyed the economy. I mean, look at Venezuela. That should be a rich country. It has massive amounts of oil. Some people say the most in the world, in terms of reserves. It's, shed 7 million refugees. It's falling apart economically. That's what happens when you have, autocrats who claim to be doing this for the betterment of the people, but inevitably they serve themselves and their cronies. On the issue of security, I faced this, I describe in the book how we faced it with George W. Bush's so-called war on terrorism. And they never admitted that they were torturing. They always pretended it was, just enhanced interrogation techniques. That was their euphemism. But they were essentially saying, we need to torture to protect you. And, ultimately, we were able to persuade the American people in the US Congress that, in fact, torture was making Americans less safe because it was completely alienating the communities that were most likely to have information about a possible terrorist threat. And torture was like the best friend of the terrorist recruiters. If somebody is tortured or if a member of your family is tortured, you are much more likely to join a terrorist group than if you've been treated lawfully. And so, again, I don't buy this argument that violations of human rights help security. Is Israel safer today because it committed a genocide in Gaza? Or is it just generating, kind of a new generation of Palestinians who hate Israel and who, unless there ultimately is a Palestinian state, are going to devote themselves to ensuring that there is one by whatever means? So I just think that these kinds of human rights shortcuts, ostensibly for the purpose of economic or security betterment, is just utterly misguided. That's not how the world works.
For example, you mentioned Gaza. We are devastating conflicts in Ukraine and Sudan, for example, and
Yeah.
many others. In such polarized situations, do you still believe international justice can deliver accountability?
I mean, it's not easy in the sense that something like the International Criminal Court, they don't have a police force, they can't arrest people. But nobody wants to be charged by the International Criminal Court. And, if you are somebody who is facing charges, somebody like Netanyahu in Israel or Putin in Russia, your only real option is to try to be president or prime minister for life, just to hang on. Because if you step down, you could face what happened to former Serbian leader Slobodan Milosevic, who thought he was safe from criminal charges. He was president of Serbia. What could happen to him? But he tried to steal an election. There was a popular uprising. The new government came in. It wanted Western sanctions lifted. The condition of that was to send Milosevic to The Hague,
Mhm.
which it did. And he died on trial in The Hague. Most recently, a good example of this is the former Philippines president, Rodrigo Duterte, who thought, he had to step down because he was term limited. He thought he would guarantee his impunity by arranging for his daughter to be vice president, which she is today. But there was a falling out between his daughter and the current president, Marcos Jr. And Marcos put Duterte on a plane to The Hague. So he is now in custody, facing charges for his so-called drug war summary executions. So I think the same issue is going to face Netanyahu and Putin. In fact, as we're talking, there are plans for Putin to meet with Trump in Hungary. And Putin has got to figure out, how do you get to Hungary? Because you can only get there by flying over states that have
Mhm.
joined the International Criminal Court. If his plane has problems, if it has to do an emergency landing, he could get arrested and sent to The Hague. So, it's good that they have to worry about this. And it doesn't guarantee that they will face justice, but it's very difficult to be president for life. And your day can easily come. So I think that, much as I'm disappointed by the slow pace of international justice, nonetheless, it remains very significant, both as a way of answering the victims' pleas for justice, but also ideally as a way of deterring tomorrow's would-be committers of mass atrocities.
Yeah. But uh, when we talk about international justice, there is a major obstacle of the issue of selectivity. Democracies often speak loudly about abuses abroad while sometimes neglecting their own shortcomings. How do you think these double standards affect the credibility of the entire human rights movement?
Well, I mean, the movement, I think, tries to be pretty principled. If you look at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, we apply the same standards to everybody. So it's not the movement, but you're right that individual governments undermine their credibility when they operate with a blatant double standard. So if you look at, the United States or even some European governments, they're all focused on, Putin's colonial invasion of Ukraine. Fair enough. But as they try to curtail his war crimes in Ukraine, if they're covering up or defending Israel's war crimes and genocide in Gaza, that, doesn't work. And a lot of governments, particularly in the global south, who are saying, well, why should we get involved in Ukraine? We care about Gaza. You're ignoring Gaza. It does undermine their credibility. So I think that, that's one reason why we push for a more consistent defense of human rights. Now, I should say that, even an inconsistent defender of human rights can make a difference. So I describe in the book how Turkey, under Erdogan, I mean, despite Erdogan's repression at home, he played a very useful role in curtailing the Russian and Syrian bombing of 3 million civilians in Idlib. And Erdogan, working with former German Chancellor Merkel and French President Macron, were able to twist Putin's arm to get him to stop. So, in this case, I mean, Erdogan is not a credible defender of human rights, but nonetheless made an important difference for 3 million people in northwestern Syria.
Yeah, totally understand. And at this moment, maybe I'd like to turn to two specific countries that raise profound questions about the rule of law. And one of them, one of them is Turkey, as you mentioned, and the other one is the United States. And given your decades of experience observing global trends,
Mhm.
how surprising is it the state of human rights in the United States today? Are there trends or issues that you see that you didn't see coming?
Well, I mean, what is deeply disturbing about what Trump is doing in the United States is how he's trying to dismantle democracy. And the US, fortunately, has a very strong democracy. It has very strong checks and balances on the executive branch of the president. But, Trump is trying to implement the classic autocrat's playbook, which is that, you use populist arguments, demonizing some unpopular minority, in his case, mostly immigrants as well as trans people, to kind of build a majority. And then once you're in power, you deliberately try to undercut the checks and balances on your power. And so Trump has gone after, the lawyers, after journalists, after judges, civil society, private foundations, universities. And there has been pushback. So he is not winning uniformly, but in some cases he is winning. And so there's a battle underway right now. But this, is a battle for really the soul of American democracy. And the there are different elements of American society that are responding differently. So, for example, the private foundations, the civic groups, they're really banding together. They're mounting a common defense. The universities have not done that. The law firms have not done that. Even the media outlets have not done that, although they've begun to do it a little bit. There was just an effort by Trump and Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, to tell journalists operating the Pentagon that they couldn't maintain their credentials unless they agreed not to disclose any unofficial information. And they all refused and they all walked out. That's a good common defense. But that kind of common defense isn't mounted enough. And our experience around the world shows that that's by far and away the most effective way of fighting back against autocracy. But that's the big threat in the United States today, far more so than even in Trump's first term, and far more so than any time in recent history.
I mean, you mentioned the American lawyers. The United States has been designated as the focus country for the 2026 International Day of the Endangered Lawyer. I mean, citing concerns over political interference with the legal profession. I mean, given your experience, I mean, how do you assess the current state of judicial independence and the rule of law in the US? You partially mentioned that, and what do you think the implications are going to be, in a nutshell?
Well, with lawyers, what Trump has done is gone after some of the big law firms and said, we are going to bar you from federal offices, really undermining a big part of your legal practice unless you cut a deal with us. And the deal often involves giving, millions upon millions of dollars worth of free legal services to Trump's pet causes. And what this is really about is trying to deter these lawyers from bringing lawsuits against the Trump administration. Now, the sad fact is that some of the big law firms have capitulated. They've appeased Trump, they've cut deals, but many others have resisted. So there again is a battle underway. With the judges, I mean, Trump has singled out certain judges by name who rule against him. But the good news is there have been something like 400 rulings against the Trump administration. So most judges are continuing to uphold the rule of law. The US Supreme Court is a tricky thing. There Trump has a presumptive 6-3 majority in his favor. And the Supreme Court has been using its so-called emergency docket to uphold various Trump moves, often without opinions. These are, temporary rulings, but they often have huge significance. But what's interesting is that in some of the cases where Trump is clearly, blatantly undermining the rule of law, he seems to be losing his majority. The 6-3 majority in his favor is turning into a 5-4 majority against him. And so it remains to be seen how often that occurs. But, you know, with the big caveat of the Supreme Court, and we just don't know where it's going, most federal judges are doing their job and are protecting, everybody from immigrants to universities to what have you, from these, completely unjustified efforts to undermine their independence on the part of the Trump administration.
Yeah. Turning to Turkey, I mean, over 1,700 of our fellow lawyers in Turkey have been arrested since 2016 simply for doing their jobs. And the methods that the government is using in this repression is also evolving, as seen in specific cases. For example, in Yalçınkaya versus Turkey, it shows that using a messaging app was criminalized as evidence of terrorism. What could you say about the misuse of anti-terror laws, digital surveillance, and due process?
Well, I mean, in those cases, I mean, what the Erdogan government has been doing, as you know, is using the fact that a particular app, the Bylock app, was on somebody's phone, which is just a messaging app.
Mhm.
That is deemed to be evidence that the person was involved in the 2016 coup. That they are not simply, adherence to the Gulen philosophy or the Gulen educational system or whatever, but they're actually criminal members of
Yeah.
the group that tried to overthrow the government. And there's no evidence of that. The mere fact that you have an app on your phone says nothing. You know, Actually, even being an adherent of Gulen, now deceased, also means nothing because lots of people went to his schools and got a good education. Lots of people were just, part of the system. It means nothing in terms of their criminality. And so the European Court has appropriately said that the mere existence of the app on a phone, which easily could be planted there, it could be there inadvertently, who knows? It's evidence of nothing. And the fact that, the courts under Erdogan are convicting people based simply on the app is ridiculous. It's a complete injustice. The court has ruled this, the government is not abiding.
Yeah. Yep. That brings me to my next question. When domestic legal systems are weaponized by governments, the international system is supposed to be a backstop. But what happens when that is ignored? For example, Turkey has repeatedly refused to implement European Court of Human Rights rulings. How should international institutions respond when a state openly defies binding human rights decisions?
Well, I mean, ideally, European governments would be pressuring the Turkish government to abide by the European court rulings. They're not doing that because Erdogan has very successfully positioned himself as important for Europe in other regards, whether it's blocking migrants from going to Europe or negotiating with Putin over Ukraine. There are other factors that European nations are prioritizing. I think it's very short-sighted because if Erdogan is allowed to continue down these autocratic routes, he's going to be a very unreliable ally. Now, the good news is I think the Turkish people are increasingly fed up with Erdogan's autocracy. And, we've seen this because Erdogan, periodically locks up a political challenger whom he deems too threatening. We saw this, last time around with Demirtas, and we see this now with, Ekrem Imamoglu,
Yeah.
where, these are, I mean, Imamoglu in particular was clearly, a very potent political threat. Some poll shows that he would have won the election. The opposition won the local elections, the mayoral elections in the last round. Erdogan, would be in trouble if he allowed a free and fair election to go forward. So he's resorting to steps that completely undermine any notion of a fair democracy. Now, the world sees through this. I mean, if he's moving in the direction of somebody like Putin or Lukashenko in Belarus, where they still hold electoral charades, but nobody pretends that these are legitimate elections, he's going to lose the legitimacy that he seeks. He's going to appear just as a dictator. So he's trying to, balance this. He's trying to have something that looks like a real election, but he's trying to really tilt the playing field. And I think it's important that governments push back and not allow these other concerns to start getting in the way of their defense of democracy.
I mean, you've covered Turkey for decades, and I was just wondering were there any moments that particularly or concerned or shocked you, especially when it comes to lawyers or any other thing?
Oh, I mean, I am shocked by the brazenness of some governments' disrespect for human rights. And what particularly bothers me is when lawyers try to justify it. We saw this with the George W. Bush administration, where he was able to handpick lawyers who justified the unjustifiable, tried to pretend that torture wasn't torture. And these so-called torture memos are widely discredited, but they had the effect of immunizing the senior officials who were ordering torture by saying, well, look we have this official opinion saying this isn't torture. We are fine. And so it was very harmful, even though at this point, these lawyers, are widely discredited. I think we're seeing something similar today as Trump is attacking suspected, supposed drug traffickers in the Caribbean. And these are, assuming that they are drug traffickers, they should be detained and prosecuted. But Trump has, taken this rhetorical war on drugs, pretended it's a real war, and is just summarily shooting people, killing, over 20 people so far. These are blatant acts of murder. Some lawyers in the White House have approved this. Now, what's interesting is the top commander who's overseeing this just resigned, basically saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with this criminality. But some lawyers have just no scruples and are enabling it to go forward. So that, legitimization of blatant violations of the law, when lawyers are involved in that, it's a huge disappointment. I think it's a real abdication of their professional responsibilities.
Totally agree. Ken, as we begin to wrap up, your career has been about navigating these immense challenges. And in your book, you talk about several wins, losses, and ongoing battles. And thinking about the losses, could you share one that still haunts you, or in retrospect, fundamentally shaped you?
I
How
mean,
you
one
approach your later
and
work?
the one that still bothers me, and I describe this at great length in the book, is that I devoted great attention and still am to China's persecution of the Uyghurs.
Mhm.
And this is China at the worst stage had locked up 1 million Uyghurs out of a population of 11 million. So this is by far and away the largest percentage of detained people in the world. Um, the former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, found these to be possible crimes against humanity. Based on her very powerful report, we went to the UN Human Rights Council and tried to put Xinjiang, China's treatment of the Uyghurs, on the agenda. We lost by very narrowly by a vote of 19-17. Xi Jinping himself was personally calling heads of state, persuading them to vote with China, not with us. So this was, a loss that had big consequences for the Uyghur people, and it was so close. One real disappointment is that governments have not revived it. You know, both, as I mentioned, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights now, Volker Turk, he refuses to criticize China for their treatment of the Uyghurs. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, has become an apologist for the Chinese government. So it's a difficult environment, but this is a loss that still haunts me because although, a number of the Uyghurs have been released from detention, they're increasingly being put into forced labor. So this remains a serious, serious problem. The Turkish government, I should say, has been, overall decent about this because of the linguistic and cultural connections between Turks and Uyghurs. But most of the world's, most of the Muslim majority governments of the world just side with China. They ignore the Uyghurs. And so this is, an ongoing major issue that continues to haunt me.
Ken, thank you very much indeed for your decades of work, for your profound insights today, and reminding us of the importance of bearing witness and righting wrong.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you very much, Ken.
Okay. Thanks so much. Okay.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Have a
Ken.
nice
All right.
day.
Cheers.
Bye.